Hello, everybody. We're excited to have you join us today for our live webinar on a topic that's been a prominent discussion here at Attentional as well as in the community and the industry: how to best leverage CICD principles for accelerating network automation and orchestration initiatives. Before we dive in, my name is Morgan Stern. I'm the VP of Automation Strategy at Attentional, and I'm joined today by Karin Munalingal, Head of Solutions Engineering here at Attentional. Hey,
Hello,
Karin.
everyone. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today. I'm looking for this discussion with Morgan.
Thank you, Karin. Hey, for today's webinar, we're going to kind of tweak the format a little bit. We're going to have an open discussion and some dialogue around a lot of the topics related to CICD. And we want to make sure it's interactive. So please feel free to ask questions in the question window, and we'll answer those questions along the way the best we can. So let's go ahead and we'll get started. So just for some background, for my career, I've been really focused primarily in the networking space, doing a lot of work with service providers. And for Karin, his experience has been a little bit different, right? He's been very much focused on software development and then moved into networking. And so he and I have been working together for a number of years, and we like to kind of talk about these areas where the technology crosses over, one of which has really been around CI/CD and network infrastructure. And it seems like probably about this time last year, the number of conversations and questions around how to apply CI/CD to network infrastructure really started to ramp up to the point where it's almost a daily conversation now. And so, in an effort to try to understand more about how folks were implementing CI/CD pipelines with respect to their automation and orchestration efforts, I really started to try to dig in because it seemed like at a high level, a lot of these conversations were similar, but the kinds of problems people were trying to solve, some of the use cases were different. And so I wanted to understand what were the things that we could kind of leave the conversation with to say, okay, this is a good example of this kind of use case, or this is a good example of this kind of use case. And so we kind of figured out along the way, there were a few things that were really different. One was the level of CICD skill and the friendliness of the particular networking domains really varied quite a bit. For example, the folks who were doing a lot of the data center work and the kind of work that they were doing really worked well in a pipeline model, whereas the folks that were doing things maybe on the optical side, it was a little bit less clear about how they could start to leverage the technology. The other thing that we started seeing was that networks and network services really had some unique challenges that made it different than the way that people were implementing CI/CD in software development shops. And subsequently, we start to see people doing a lot of different kinds of approaches, leveraging some of the same tools and in some cases different tools to solve for problems. And the other thing that we kind of took away was we were seeing some teams doing some really cool stuff, that they were taking pipelines much further than we had been thinking about. They started looking across different automation and orchestration technologies, for example, across multiple domains, starting to do some really advanced kind of testing use cases that we'll talk about in a little bit, and just really started to see things go in a really, I think, interesting direction. So one of the things that we started looking at was, okay, so in what ways is networking and network orchestration and automation, how is it like the software development process, and how is it different? And I think from our perspective and from a lot of the things that I was seeing, there were really three areas that we were seeing that there were some unique things about network pipelines that were different from software pipelines. The first is really around that notion of payload generation. Whether you're using a pipeline to make a configuration change to the network, or if you're using a pipeline to manage your scripts and workflows, the way that you generate that code is a little bit different than software, particularly when you're talking about configuration. So for network configuration, typically you're going to have some set of variables for the particular task at hand. Might be IP addresses, might be things related to routing, could be firewall rules, could be whatever. But there's some amount of network engineering that is outside of just creating the code that is different. And so that information that is used as part of that code creation can come from a lot of different sources. It can come from engineering rules. It can come from configuration standards, golden configs. It can come from sources of truth. So that set of activities really needs to get some closer consideration when you're thinking about, okay, I'm going to create a pipeline. I need to figure out the payload generation piece. Next is around payload testing. To say that in the software model, pretty well understood process for doing unit testing, integration testing, system testing. In a lot of scenarios for network changes, people were basically saying, well, does this break anything? Like, do I get the outcome I want? But in a lot of cases, the testing isn't really possible in a pre-production setting because of the complexities of the production network. Sometimes are really hard to replicate. And so people are looking at how can I use pipelines and how can I use CI testing to better replicate the kinds of things that I need to do for my test activities. And then the third area is around payload deployment. Like, how do I get the change that I made into the network? I think there's a pretty robust set of tools in the software world for doing continuous deployment. But in the network, it's a little bit of a different kind of situation, right? Typically, if people are doing it manually, they're going to log into a CLI. They might run a script. They need to do pre and post checks. And for any kind of complex changes, order of operations becomes really critical, right? So, Karin, I know you and I were talking a little bit before the call, and you thought up a pretty good example of a scenario where order of operations was important. Do you want to talk about that for a second?
Yes, absolutely. And before I get to that, Morgan, I think it's important to reemphasize the fact that as the industry and all the practitioners start thinking about as everything as code, right? X as code. It is important to kind of take a step back and look at, well, I were to write a function. That's great, right? That's me creating code, which technically would count as a payload in this case. But when you're talking about network engineers and cloud architects and SREs, when they look at their little function around their specific domain, how does that resonate into this specific concept around CI/CD, right? So that's very important because, as you mentioned early on, one of the challenges within the network is identifying which domain you're working in and what counts as that specific part of code, right? It might be configuration, as you mentioned, right? Whether it's golden configuration for the network or the cloud. It might be just parameters that you're tracking within your Git, right? It's slightly different than a function that you're carrying forward from your staging into production, et cetera. And, I like the part where you mentioned around payload testing, right? In this case, I could write unit tests, I could write integration test for me to test that function for my own application. But how does that look like for a problem that we, always talk about with our customers is now I'm into multiple domains that have to address this as part of network being one of them, data center another one, and cloud, right? Granted that we're using various different technologies to perform the deployment part of it, that brings us to the next part where how do you address consistent testing and deployment across these domains, especially leveraging different technologies, right? And the example that I mentioned before the call started, Morgan, is you might have an application connectivity service that you're trying to perform the concept of CI/CD around, and that requires you to touch various different technologies across these domains, right? Let alone just me having to test the infrastructure piece of it. Yes, I can create an application. Before I create an application, I have to create the infrastructure for it. So how do I do a CI/CD specifically around the infrastructure and then the networking, and then tie that together with your on-prem assets, right? Firewall, load balancer configuration, but also to the front side of it where you're having to deal with single source of truth or multiple distributed sources of truth. So as we take a look at and talk about CI/CD as a whole for a network use case or a cloud use case, how does that resonate with multiple different teams that are actually participating as part of this process? That's why it becomes key for every team and every group to kind of take a look at it, not only from their domains, technology, and goals perspective, but also from an end-to-end multi-domain solution that they're trying to provide to their end consumers.
It's a good point. It's a really good point. And I think that for me was kind of one of the takeaways from talking to these groups, was kind of looking at these processes and recognizing like there's a couple of different, I think, categories of use cases that we started seeing some consistency around. And I felt like, it's probably important for us to start to reinforce that when folks are talking about CICD in the network world, they're usually talking about one of two things. And in the beginning of the conversation, it's really good to sort of say, okay, so what's your area of focus? Like, what is the artifact that is going through the pipeline? And so the more investigation that we did, I kind of started to see things breaking into these two categories. One was people wanted to use pipelines to manage specific changes to the network environment. So whether it was a chunk of CLI code or some other set of specific configuration parameters, they wanted to build pipelines around how do I better deploy that change into my network, and how do I leverage the capabilities of a pipeline to do that more predictably, consistently, reliably, etc. The second one, and I think that this is an area that we really started to see become more and more important as folks were building their libraries of assets, or what we're calling workflows and scripts as code, where they may have some library of playbooks, they may have some library of workflows or scripts, and those scripts now need to have a lifecycle wrapped around them, so that anybody who's working in this space knows that if you don't manage it, entropy will kick in, and you will start to have not just some, but a ton of different scripts, workflows, etc. And so being able to have a mechanism to manage the lifecycle of those, meaning if I make a change, I want to be able to version it. I want to be able to understand interdependencies between components. I want to be able to evolve those and better manage how I get those tested and implemented in the network. That becomes the focal point for that second category of CI/CD for network. So what we'll do is we'll start today. We'll start talking about configs as code. Time permitting, we'll talk about workflows and scripts as code. And then our plan is that this will be the first of a series of webinars where we can now start to dig deeper into these areas, show examples, bring in subject matter experts to be able to talk about implementations, and kind of help folks better evolve their thinking and get better benefits out of using CI/CD. So we'll kick over to talk about using CI/CD for the network operations teams and for change management. So this is the config as code model. Folks who have been on some of our other webinars, this is a familiar diagram, and I think it's useful because it replicates the change process and the change management in a lot of the environments that we're interacting with. From a high level, right, this might be executed by multiple people, or there may be a smaller set of folks, but ultimately the pieces are pretty consistent. A change request comes in, people need to collect information from sources of truth and generate the configuration change. Then it moves into a deployment process where it might be during a maintenance window or during the day where people are going to perform some set of checks. They'll deploy the change. They'll do a post check, and then they need to go do kind of the closing out activities around. I need to update the sources of truth to make sure that they reflect the change has occurred. I need to close the ticket, and I need to close out the request. Now, one of the things that folks who are looking towards CI/CD to like the benefits that they're looking for is, how do I do this faster? How do I do this with less risk? How do I do this more consistently? How do I do this at scale? And there's some advantages that they're seeing by implementing pipelines in the right place. to be able to get that consistency, that speed, that scale, to be able to carry that change through the process, and then leverage the appropriate component technologies at each of the places. So if we think back to the slide that we were talking about before, where we're saying, okay, I've got a payload generation, payload testing, payload deployment, then we can kind of overlay that into this process and say, these pieces in the middle, the pre-check, the deployment, the post-check, these are really kind of focused around payload deployment. And in a lot of the scenarios that we have been interacting with folks who are currently doing CI/CD, this is really what they're focused on, is how do I get this change deployed in the most consistent, reliable way? But what we're starting to see as folks become more comfortable with the technology, they're starting to expand that and to say, look, I want to not only do the things I already was doing better, but I want to be able to do things that my current process and my current model doesn't allow. Specifically, can I leverage CI/CD and pipelines to do more thorough testing before I go into deployment mode? Right. So I'm still going to do my pre-checks, my post-checks, but now I've got a framework that I can use to really enhance and extend the level of testing I'm doing in a way that is not super resource intensive because it's using a pipeline and pipeline automation to actually perform the tests and approvals and things like that. And then there's these other areas that we've talked about, right? Like, okay, how do we start to introduce the payload generation into the pipeline? How do we start to introduce system updates into the pipeline? And those are the things that we're starting to see people moving towards.
And Morgan, and
Yeah.
so very similar to the adoption around network automation in general, right? Like the focus starts from what am I doing consistently every single day, manually? Let me go create a script for that. It's a very similar concept around CI/CD as well. As organizations and practitioners get more comfortable, taking the route around automation for their network activities, the first progressive step is towards applying CI/CD principles for those assets that they have created, right? So it comes, full circle around, hey, I've taken the initiative to eliminate the human efforts and create a script for it or a playbook for it. How do I make this more deployable at scale by wrapping this a CI/CD concept around it? And that's why when we have conversations with a lot of our champions in the industry, personally, what I get to hear is, hey, like I've created a pipeline that does some level of testing, unit level testing for the script or a playbook that I've created with some of the parameters. And it also does some testing around the deployment. But as you kind of pointed out, Morgan, as they get more comfortable with that deployment or the network specific automation piece, now the goal for the organization to widen that out. And as they kind of spread the net wider around adopting, how do I automate data gathering? How do I automate updating adjacent systems? Now it's time to start thinking about, can I now apply CI/CD as a whole across the entire space versus just that specific piece that is a network change piece, right? So it's very interesting as we talk to more and more customers and feel a little bit more excited about the fact that they are now adopting CI/CD for the things that they have created, which is network facing. But how about all the other things that they still have to do in order to provide a service that is more consumable at space for their customers, at scale, sorry.
Yep. Right. I think so. When we look at this process, then the question becomes, okay, how do I take what has normally been a very ticket-driven activity or potentially an email-driven activity? How do I evolve that towards a pipeline? And so what we're seeing now is really folks saying, okay, I know that there are tools that can do a much better job of managing code than my spreadsheet or some of my other systems. So they're starting to leverage things like repositories to then become the asset or the sort of the asset bank of where they're putting the changes and then using that to kind of carry the change through the pipeline. So typically what's happening is they're going to generate the configuration change. They will then do a merge request, or new branch, to say, okay, this is a change to what is currently in master. That branch then will go through the pipeline. So they'll do a configuration testing. There'll be some approval process. Once it's approved, then it'll get merged back into master. The version number will get bumped. It'll go through staging. Then it gets deployed to production, and then the system updates happen. Right. So this is really the first step to say, okay, I've got those activities that were happening. I'm now going to stitch them together with a pipeline. But I think where the really interesting opportunities exist is when you take this a step further to say, can I really leverage automation technology, orchestration technology to enhance how I'm doing the payload generation, to enhance how I'm doing the testing, how I'm doing the deployment, and how I'm doing the system updates, so that I'm getting the best of both worlds and really using the technologies in the way that we feel they're intended, to say, yeah, pipeline really good at managing the process of change, and the automation and orchestration tools are really good at managing the components of that, as well as kind of the generation of payload and testing activities. So when you start to kind of overlay the two kinds of technologies, what we're representing here in orange, that's the CICD pipeline. Its focus is on, can I create a consistent, repeatable process? Can I automate those activities that previously were manual activities? Can I manage things like code versioning, testing coordination, merging, validation, approval, all of those things that folks have been doing in the software world for years? Now we're just applying it to the network piece. And then I'm using the network automation and orchestration tools then to help me automate the process for generating that payload, like to be able to reach into the sources of truth, to be able to codify the engineering rules in software, so that now I can just automatically, dynamically generate that configuration change based on the request. And I don't need to expend any kind of engineering time to do that part. And then next, in the testing piece, to say, well, I think in a lot of environments, the amount of testing that was being done was really just a function of available resources, both in terms of like lab assets and time of what people could do. So they only did 3 tests because that's all they had time to do. But if we start to leverage, how can I use network automation along with CI/CD tools and some of the ecosystem to be able to better perform the testing, right? Not just executing the test, but also can I leverage some of the automation and some of the ecosystem tools to be able to establish the testing environment, right? So uh, I think a lot of companies are starting to get into this game of providing tools that can generate lab environments based on production network. I know Nokia has got a lot of things happening with the sandbox, for example, and they're not alone. But can I leverage tools like that then to replicate the appropriate network environment so that the test I want to perform can be adequate and I've got the right scope? And that's going to improve my confidence in the change, which means I can then execute that in an automated fashion, get a higher level of confidence, and then push it out to deployment. And then when we get to deployment, right? Karin's point around, well, we see a lot of these use cases where it's multi-domain, which means there's multiple different tools, there's different technologies, there's really different models for how the information is represented. And it's very different from a software where I may be pushing out a new piece of code, a new module, whatever. It's operating within a pretty homogeneous environment. Here, now I've got to be able to deploy multiple changes, multiple technologies, do it in a very specific order of operations. There's a lot more complexity for any kind of multi-domain network service that you need to make sure that you're utilizing a technology that's got the ability to do those kinds of activities.
Understood. And Morgan, I think what's important to call out here is when you look at a plethora of customers that we work with, right? Some of them are, very aggressive with respect to, hey, this is my focus change. I've created a pipeline around it. I feel comfortable with it, so I'm going to push it into production, right? That's one. But now you also have customers that we work with that rather take, you know, um, 6 to 8 weeks before things make it into production, is because they're from a CI/CD perspective. Their thought process around testing is, I'm going to test in my dev, I'm going to test in my staging, I'm going to test in my pre-prod, and then finally into production, right? So there's, obviously from a timing perspective, everyone wants to scale their concept of CI/CD and have rapid changes go into production so they can help support the services, the business services that they're providing to the market. But it doesn't have to be either end of the spectrum, right? I think leveraging the right tool for the right job, which is a critical piece that you mentioned as part of this presentation early and right now, is, pipelines are great at what they do. Network automations and orchestration tools are great at what they do. I think if we're to combine the efforts and the capability, it enables customers who are aggressive as well as more risk averse to kind of come to a common ground and empower them to actually make changes to the so-called code or configuration that they have created and take the right steps, whether it's going through 3 different environment before it makes into production or just one, right? But the level of confidence that they could have now, because they have the ability to leverage both pipelines as well as orchestration tools in order to do this on different environment and at scale, it means a lot, right? I think to the market, but also to practitioners, where they say, I've done my part of writing a unit test for a script that I've created, but as soon as I check that in, there is something else that's going to test that in an integrated fashion against every other tool that participates as part of this use case.
Cool. Just a reminder, we have received a couple of questions, which we'll be addressing momentarily. But for those of you, if you have questions, please use the question functionality, and we will answer that. Okay. Oh, hey, here's one question that's relevant to this section. So config as code probably needs configuration modeling. Can you throw some light on what models are being used? Network OEMs drive the configurations that need to be modeled appropriately. Karan, do you want to talk a little bit about like what kinds of models are people using for configuration modeling and kind of what we see that's happening out in the field?
Understood. Talking about network OEM, right? It's every single vendor, and some of the other technologies that we work with tend to model the network as well as the device itself. From our perspective, when you talk about config as code in different domains, it means something slightly different. For example, in the cloud, when we're dealing with folks leveraging things like HashiCorp, Terraform, right? And that asset, how do we treat the HCL as code, right? And when we're talking about firewalls and just network routers, how do we treat, models like, someone were to model a device in Yang, someone were to model a device in JSON, right? So from our perspective, Morgan, as we work with various different vendors as well as different customers that want to leverage some of the net new things that vendors are rolling out, it is a combination of multiple different modeling techniques, right? From Identical's perspective, we have adopted JSON as a model, right? That applies both across your cloud assets, data center assets, as well as your network assets, where there is always, a challenge to transform one model into the other. And that's why there's a lot of tools out there available that help you do that. But essentially, instead of, saying that this is the only model I want to work with, I think it is critical that network automation and orchestration tools enable and empower customers to leverage the right model for those technologies as well as those domains. So, it's critical as, the whole concept of SDN and vendors move towards modern networks and provide more and more capabilities with JSON and APIs in mind. How do we leverage a combination of that and our standards around Yang and Tosca
Yeah, and one of the things, I don't think we haven't talked about this one recently, but I think that one of the things that I have been a little bit frustrated, uh, sort of in the community is, I think that while the move to NetConf and Yang is good, important, kind of inevitable, um, I think that we're getting to the point in a lot of organizations where kind of folks are realizing like, okay, this didn't quite do exactly what I wanted it to do, right? Like things like open config, really good initiatives, maybe not quite getting as far as people would like to get towards a real like vendor specific implementation agnostic model. Karin, do you see the same thing?
Yes, and with experience, it's a similar experience that we have, also had internally as we try to create automation, leveraging some of these, open config standards that folks are rolling out. Right. In theory, it's a great aspiration for someone to have that abstracted level, but in reality, when you start working across, multiple domains, and you brought up things like optical early on, it is a challenge when you try to do that across the board, right? In a single domain, on a specific set of technologies or vendor, it might work great, but as we know, more and more, organizations are adopting and taking a vendor agnostic approach where they do have more than one vendor in their network that they have to support and cater to with respect to not only automation but orchestration.
Okay. So this is a model that we've been using and socializing for some time. I think it's really about saying like, okay, best of both worlds for this config as code use case. Let's utilize uh, things like Itential, and we know that folks have pretty diverse tool sets, right? Let's use the technology to generate payloads, do the testing, validation, and deployment. What I'd like to do now for this next part is shift the conversation. And I know one of the questions that came in was specific to this, but this is, to me, the area that is emerging. I think folks have been doing config CICD pipelines, and those have been maturing quite a bit. But now folks are really starting to look at how do I leverage pipelines for my workflows, assets, things like that. At the beginning of the session, I mentioned this is the first of a series of webinars and sessions that we're going to have around CICD. I think once we get this groundwork laid, the direction that we'd like to go is to get more and more concrete and start to show specific examples. So one of the areas that we've received feedback from customers and have started to provide some functionality both in our like pre-built library as well as in the base product and the integrations we're supporting is how can they leverage CI/CD pipelines to manage the assets that they create on the Itential platform, to manage versioning and things like that, and as well as to manage their scripts and workflows from other products. So for this use case, just to kind of reiterate, here the focal point is I need to lifecycle manage these components that I'm actually using to automate and orchestrate my network. And these can be workflows and scripts, like I've mentioned. They can also be things like templates. We've got a lot of folks that are leveraging things like Jinja 2 for templating, forms, playbooks, Terraform plans, things like that. The focal point is a little bit different here, right? We still will need to generate a payload, right? I'm going to create my asset. But then the way that I manage this then becomes a little bit different. Here, things like versioning become critical. Dependencies become super important if folks are doing more modular kinds of designs. So in the orchestration world, people are talking about network as a service. Folks like TMF are starting to come up with frameworks and models where you decompose into multiple resource-facing services, customer-facing services. Once I start to decouple the functionality and go more modular, now my number of dependencies goes up, and I need better tools to be able to manage that. One of the demos that we'll do in a subsequent session will be to show specifically some of the capabilities that we're making available in some already available, some will be available this year on the Itential platform around how do you define modular sets of code and then enable that to be put into the pipeline and versioned and tested and etc. So like I said, it's combination things that we already have and some of the integrations we already have, and then functionality that's was released in our prior release and in the upcoming release will be focused around that, to be able to say I need to minimally be able to define the boundary of what the module is that I want to run through the pipeline. But then it becomes a function of saying, okay, for each workflow, and we'll just use that as an example. It could be script, could be anything else. It's going to have a scope. That's going to have a set of things that it's going to be focused around doing, which then means if I want to test this, not only do I need to test this within the context of the other modules that I have out there, but I need to test this in some kind of an environment, like a network environment that's at least sufficiently like production so that there are less opportunities for unintended consequences. And over time, I can start to build that test set. I can start to do regression testing. I can extend my reach into being able to set up different network environments potentially to be able to test some of these flows. Becomes really then, like I said, a focal point of saying, yeah, this is a lifecycle thing now that I have these assets and I need a better mechanism to be able to manage those and deploy those.
And
So,
just
oh,
one
go ahead,
thing I
Karan.
want
Sorry.
to, if you kind of look at the question that came through, right? It's always a balance around using the right tool for the right job, right? As we mentioned early on, I think this specific use case will be perfect, like the scenario around us leveraging the pipeline, to do its thing around, um, you know, consistently pushing the right things in the right environment, right? But when someone builds a script, someone builds a workflow, someone builds, a Jinja template, for example, within the platform, now you have the ability to walk that asset through the same pipeline as you are writing code, like a function, right? So essentially, what we're going to try and showcase in the subsequent webinars around CICD is how customers can actually do that and effectively leverage their pipelines in order to not only version, approve, but also test, which one of the main themes here is how can we help promote further tests that are more than just linting or syntax checking as part of your pipeline, right? This becomes critical because as you modify each one of these components that actually, help your use case go into production, as you modify each one of these components, how do we holistically perform a set of integration tests that you can grow over time? And this actually happens in conjunction with some of the existing technologies, whether it's, digital twin or simulation things that you're already using across multiple spaces. So I just wanted to quickly call that out with regard to, leveraging the power of pipelining and Git from a versioning aspect of things, but also supporting how consumers of something like Itential can leverage that as a way to promote their assets that they create aggressively into production with, test as well as approval as part of that process. Sorry, Morgan.
Yeah, I was muted. Sorry about that, folks. I was talking to mute. So yeah, this is, I think, one of the areas that I'm really keenly interested in because I see this as a space that there's a lot of opportunity for creativity and innovation. And looks like there was another question that came in that's like really, I think, very connected to that, to say there's this set of now almost like metadata that we need to figure out how to best define around a particular asset. So whether it's a script, workflow, whatever, as I mentioned, it's got a scope, which means it's going to have some set of tests that are going to be required to be able to effectively test that, which then means like, okay, if I'm a workflow designer, there needs to be a better mechanism for me to be able to say, yep, these are the tests that I need to run, which then means the capability needs to exist, or we need to have a path towards the capability to do that. So one of the conversations, for example, that we're having is with folks who are more in the traditional testing space. So that I know we did a very early implementation some years ago to be able to have a pipeline, and this was a pretty primitive pipeline that would then run through a robust set of testing, which meant we then had to work with the teams to say, okay, let's make sure that we scope this properly so that we manage the test assets, that we manage the test cases, that we have the ability to identify test cases. I think that there are good sets of tools now around some of that organization and management. It's really now how do we connect that then to the assets that we're creating to say that wanting to go beyond what Karin referenced around linting and syntax checking and saying, well, is the code internally okay? It's really be able to say, yeah, not only is this written properly, it's also not going to mess things up when we deploy it. And I will also have a mechanism to roll back if I need to. Okay, so Karin, I think one of the things, as I mentioned, like for me, it's really interesting to be able to work with innovative teams that are focused on trying to take the technology as far as it can possibly go. As a vendor, we need to make sure that we're doing things to support that, right? And so, to some things, as I mentioned, we're going to be demonstrating capabilities that are native to the platform around providing tools for doing versioning of our assets. We've also got things like the adapters and integrations that provide better reach into the existing tools. But what I see now, and we're starting to see announcements and we're starting to see new products, both in the open source community and in the vendor space that are more oriented around network CICD. So can I manage these things, test these things, deploy these things in a way that is leveraging the pipeline technology, but at the same time it is really purpose built around network use cases. The other area where I see a ton of innovation happening, and I think that this is going to get very interesting very fast. Karin mentioned things like digital twin, but being able to have a accurate representation of the network such that it'll support the testing scenarios that we need to support. I think that is a really productive area for folks to be focused on because that will increase reliability and that will increase speed. And so one of the conversations we had while we were preparing for this was we kind of see two ends of the spectrum, right? Karin, you want to talk about the YOLO conversation we had?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I briefly mentioned that there, from adoption around CI/CD has kicked off, and it's taken off. Obviously, there's a lot of folks in an organization doing that, small to large, right? But when we talk about rapid changes that need to make it into production to help support the business, there are two different approaches that someone would take. And I jokingly mentioned YOLO approach, right? You only live once. So you basically make a change into your script, do a unit test, and you're happy with the unit test that you ran against your single device and you feel comfortable and you push that into production, right? At that point, that the automation or script or whatever asset that you're pushing into production has not passed the stages like it would have for someone who is wanting to do this across 4 different environments, right? So those are 2 different ends of the spectrum where, even though it's very easy for me to go and make a simple change into a script, test that against a device and warrant and guarantee that, yep, it's going to work against that device. You really know any impacts of that specific script if it's part of your entire orchestration service that you're trying to roll out, right? You don't know what the impact of that change would be if someone were to provide a bad payload to your script, right? Or a completely different payload that you did not account for, right? So when you're talking about, CI/CD from a CD perspective, continuous deployment is something that we talked about today a lot, Morgan. But as you mentioned, right, a lot of customers want to do this rapidly at scale. So the continuous dev is what we're also aiming to support. And that's where the combination of things like, ease of integration, rapidly being able to build some of these automation quickly and put them through your test phases becomes very important versus having to talk about, tech debt around code and scripts that you have to manage through each one of these stages. So I know that's, it's a long way of saying, there are two different ends of the spectrum that customers are at today. How do we kind of help them bring a balance so that way they can do that same level of testing and have that same level of assurance for every single service and automation that they roll out, but also don't have to, compromise on the quality of it.
Good point. Good point. We've been doing this long enough. We've seen kind of any approach you can imagine. Some folks take 6 to 9 months to test something. Some folks just push it live. And I think that understanding the convenience of pushing it to live, but the security of extensive testing, I think really the pipelines represent an opportunity to rapidly expand your test coverage without the overhead and tax of manually doing all that testing. The other thing that we're starting to see, and I think that I spoke at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and this is one of the points I brought up, was we're starting to see that there is this need for some level of attention and discipline around how do you manage the assets and the life cycle of assets. And I think pipeline being one of the key tools that you need to be able to do that. But I'm already starting to see some real differentiation in the community of the folks that have paid attention to asset lifecycle management are starting to get a level of velocity, whereas the folks that maybe have not been paying as much attention sort of hit a ceiling. They see some really great results early on, but over time, the overhead of managing the assets and kind of the technical debt that they've incurred because they don't really have a good mechanism for versioning and controlling things, things start to slow down. And so I think that this will be a trend that we see continuing, and I think it's going to accelerate that the folks, and this is still emerging. Like I really want to make sure that nobody thinks like, hey, this is a problem that is solved. This is an emerging space. And so our reaction as a vendor, right, is to try to support as much as possible. But we also see other vendors moving at different paces, and just kind of the knowledge level of the community is starting to rise. So this is one area, again, I think is going to be important, is to say, let's make sure that to the extent that we can use what's available to us to gain an advantage, this is going to become important. And then the other thing that I see happening is this sort of next evolution of specialty or skill set or kind of engineering tasks that initially the networking folks were CLI centric, then some of them started picking up scripting and some development. Now you've got this additional capability that's going to become valuable in the market of saying, yes, I not only do I understand scripting, I understand CICD pipelines, and I understand how to apply them to the network. So I see that as an additional dimension of where things are going. Karan, did you have anything to add before we wrap things up?
Yeah, I think the innovation is something that stands out, right, Morgan? As we speak of, like, nothing is stagnant. As enterprises and SPs continue to consume all the innovation that is being put out by the network as well as the cloud vendors, it is key that your entire CI/CD mentality as well as the approach has to be nimble. How do you incorporate a brand new technology as part of your strategy, but also wrap CI/CD around that, right? Easier said than done, where it's just a script, it's all Python, it's all code, that's great. But as you start onboarding SD-WAN technologies, data center technologies, cloud technologies that have a combination of different interfaces, whether it's API or Ansible, what have you. But it's critical as the innovation comes. If you're not prepared and nimble with respect to easily integrating and onboarding that as part of your CI/CD strategy, with which absolutely includes, testing and the deployment piece. As you mentioned early on in our presentation, there are multiple ways to deploy things in the network, right? That's one of the challenges. But another challenge is also consuming new things that are coming to market, right? It's not always going to be the same. So that's why I think the focus on ease of consuming the innovation and ease of wrapping your CI/CD principles around that will become key. And I know these are some of the things that we're going to discuss in the next few sessions within this series, but I just wanted to call that out loud and clear around as organizations start to leverage so many different technologies across all their domains that they have to support for the business. Keep in mind that it's not just going to be, one thing to rule them all, right? It's always
Yep.
going to be a combination.
And it's going to change. Yeah. No, really, really good points. Okay. Thank you, Karin. That was great. I think that, I wanted to thank everybody for attending today's session. I think this is useful because and critical to establish the conceptual framework for the sessions that we're planning for in the future. So thank you for participating in this session. I will suggest and recommend you can subscribe to our Bright Talk channel, kind of keep an eye out for future emails or other messages from us about the next sessions. But the intent is that now that we've got this groundwork laid, subsequent sessions will be demonstrations, examples, conversations with subject matter experts, things like that. So thanks. And for any of the questions that we were not able to get to, we will get back to you in email. And I want to say once again, thank you, everybody, and look forward to seeing you in our next sessions. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Morgan.